All righty, Panthers. So here we are. We've been talking about the growth of the cities and the immigrants coming in and industrialization and everything taking place in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. So today we're going to take a look at immigration, the age of immigration, when there's just on a percentage basis more immigrants coming into the country than any other time in American history. And this is from about 1880 to about 1920, we're talking about. All right. So there are different groups of immigrants that come in. From 1800 to about 1880 or so, um, most of the immigrants are coming from Northwest Europe. Most of these immigrants are Irish, lots and lots of Irish coming in here, and they're known as the old immigrants. So they're coming in, Northwestern European, mostly Irish. God, we hate them. We don't like them at all, right? No, no Irish need apply and all of that stuff. New immigrants come in right around 1880, 1885, right around in there. I know it says 1891, but we're going to say 1890, and they go on until 1820. And the immigration pattern shifts for the new immigrants, and they're coming from southeastern Europe. Lots and lots and lots and lots of Italians. Lots of Italians, lots of Greeks, lots of Russians, Germans coming in at this time. We're getting a lot of people coming in from Turkey and the Middle East. Okay. They're all coming here for the exact same reason. They're all coming here for economic opportunities, and they're coming here to escape religious or political problems back home. Everybody emigrates somewhere because they believe that it's better there than it is where it is that they're currently living. And that's why immigration takes place. And so people, even though they know when they come to the United States, it's going to be a bad experience. There's going to be a lot of hatred. There's going to be a lot of bigotry. There's going to be a lot of um, prejudice against them. But they believe, despite all that, this is still better than where it is that they're coming from. Most of these immigrants are going to come through Ellis Island. Most of the new immigrants, I should say, are going to come through Ellis Island in New York. You think of where Statue of Liberty is. Ellis Island is right next to it, and that's where they would process the immigrants through into the United States. On the West Coast, where we're getting a lot of Asian immigrants coming in, mostly Chinese, but there is some Japanese and some Koreans coming in there as well. They're going to come through an island right off the coast of San Francisco known as Angel Island. And it's the exact same thing as Ellis Island, where they process through these immigrants into the country. Now, once they're in the country, they have to go through a physical. They have to show papers on where they're from and so on and so forth. Once they're into the country, they have no idea where to go, right? They're put on a boat. They're taken to the harbor in New York City or San Francisco, and they're just dumped. And hey, have a nice life. Remember, they kind of showed that in the video clip we watched the other day. They don't know anybody. They don't know where to go to live. They don't know where to get a job. Many of them don't speak the language. They have no idea about anything about where they're at. Just imagine that. At this moment, let's say we all decided to up and move to Turkmenistan. Anybody know anything about Turkmenistan? Know where to go? Know where to get a job? Know where to go find a house? No, of course not. And that's what these people are going through when they get here. They all stand out, right? They're easy to pick out. They dress differently. They have different traditional dress where they come from than, say, the American dress. They all have very heavy accents. Some of them look different, so they are really easy to pick out from a crowd, and they can't hide. Very often they would change their names to make their names sound more American sounding. When they were coming through immigration, they would change their name to Smith or Jones or something like that to make it more American sounding so their name didn't stand out as being such an ethnic name. But it still made them easy targets for prejudice and easy targets for bigotry. And so very often they all face terrible prejudice, hate, and discrimination. So here's what they began to do. Okay, they would begin looking for places where people look like them, talk like them, act like them, right? Where they all have the same experience. And so these immigrants begin to concentrate and congregate into neighborhoods where everybody in that neighborhood is just like them. Everybody in that neighborhood has the same experiences. Everybody in that neighborhood has the same cultural backgrounds and beliefs as they do. And so they begin to move there because it creates like an insulation for them from a lot of the bigotry and prejudice that they were encountering in their daily lives. They could come to this neighborhood and where they live, and they could be insulated from all that because everybody there was just like them. It gave them a degree of safety and a degree of comfort as well. And this picture here is actually a picture of an Italian neighborhood, Mulberry Street in New York City. So these are all Italian immigrants in this neighborhood here. And these neighborhoods where there's lots and lots and lots of immigrants congregating become known as little neighborhoods, right? So you get neighborhoods like Little Italy, Chinatown, Little Puerto Rico, Little Havana, or some of these little neighborhoods, famous little neighborhoods. Obviously, the most famous one is Chinatown in San Francisco. Most of these little neighborhoods tend to be on the East Coast because that's where most of the immigrants were. When you get into the interior of the country, like Colorado, there's not a lot of little neighborhoods because we really didn't attract a lot of immigrants here. It was harder for them to get here. But if you go back east, still today, a lot of these little neighborhoods, little traditional ethnic neighborhoods still exist still today. But again, there wasn't a lot here in Denver. There were some here in Denver, and there's still some in Denver. If you go to, like Alameda and Federal, right in that area there's a lot of Southeastern Asian immigrants there, a lot of Laotian, a lot of Vietnamese, a lot of um, a lot of oh gosh, I can't remember the other group there. But there's a lot of Southeastern Asians in that neighborhood. And if you look around, there's a lot of Southeast Asian um, restaurants and stores and other businesses that cater to Southeast Asians because it's a little neighborhood in right there in Alameda and Federal. The most famous little neighborhood here in Denver happened to be right over on 18th and Lawrence in downtown Denver. If you know where Coors Field is, it was right there. And there was a heavy concentration of Chinese immigrants in that neighborhood, and it was known as Hop Alley. And this is a picture of Hop Alley here, downtown Denver. This is, probably 1890s or so. And Hop Alley is where all the Chinese immigrants lived. There was a fairly large Chinese immigrant population in Denver at that time. They came in with the railroads and they're working in mining and so on. And some of them broke away from the railroads and mining, and they set up their own shops. And they had um, Chinese restaurants. There were Chinese restaurants there. There were cleaners there. A lot of the Chinese in Denver took a job of cleaning the streets, which was a really important job back then because we have no cars. So the mode of transportation is horses, and horses, as they're going up and down the street, do what horses do. And if you don't clean it, it begins to smell. And the smell of horse manure was very common in larger cities. And in some of the cities, the horse manure got so deep that men and women would have to lift up their dresses or their pant legs as they stepped across the horse manure so they wouldn't get horse manure on their dresses or pant legs. So the Chinese lived in this neighborhood, Hop Alley. For the most part, people tolerated them, but they weren't really happy about the presence of the Chinese immigrants in Denver. And then on October 31st, 1880, things go bad. Um, Along Larimer Street at this time in downtown Denver, then as now, Larimer Street was lined with bars and saloons. And so in these bars and saloons were cowboys and miners and railroad workers, and they're all in there getting drunk. And if you've ever been around a drunk person, you know, very often when they get a few drinks in them, they become like 10 feet tall and bulletproof. So this one cowboy in the bar, he goes, "You know what? I'm just tired of all the Chinese in this town. I don't like them. I don't want them. And you know what we ought to do? I'm telling you, Fred, we're going to get rid of Chinese. Are you with me?" Well, this bar of drunken cowboys go, "Yeah, we're with you. We're with you, Roger. Let's go get those Chinese." And so this drunken mob of miners and cowboys and railroad workers come stumbling out of this bar. And as they're making their way down Larimer Street, stumbling, they're passing all these other bars. And all these other drunken railroad workers and cowboys and whatnot are in the bar, and they, "Where are you going? We're gonna go teach the Chinese a lesson. Come with us." "I'm with you. Let me grab my beer." And so they start stumbling down the road. So by the time they get to Hop Alley, this is a very large drunken horde, and they absolutely destroy Hop Alley. They burn it to the ground. They destroy the buildings. Anybody who even looked Chinese was beaten, and it was just a horrific sight. So this is the riot in Hop Alley on October 31st, 1880. Because of this, a lot of towns, mining towns and camps around Colorado, which had a lot of Chinese work in there, began to pass laws banning the Chinese from entering there, because they just didn't want a riot like this taking place again. In fact, unless it's been changed, in Leadville, Colorado, there is still a law on the books forbidding anyone of Chinese, who is Chinese, from entering the city limits. And the penalty for that is hanging. If a Chinese person is found within the city limits of Leadville, they're to be hung. Now, obviously, they don't. This law is no longer enforced, and it's just one of these old laws that's still on the books. As far as I know, they've never taken it off. And this is a plaque on a building there on 18th and Lawrence. If you go down to downtown Denver, kind of across the street from Coors Field, there's this plaque on a building there talking about the riot in Hop Alley in 1880. Huh. See, that's why history's cool, y'all. So most of these neighborhoods, these little neighborhoods, were in the worst parts of the cities, in the slums of the cities. This is what they could afford, and it tended to be close to their jobs where they worked, were in the factories and places like that, slaughterhouses, which were very low-paying jobs and were very undesirable jobs. But these were the only jobs that they could get, and most of these immigrants were pretty willing to take them. But they paid very, very little. So this is where they lived. This is what they could afford to live. There's no trash pickup. So your trash was just kind of left in the streets or in the hallways of buildings as it rotted, right? So you had rotting food out there. You'd have, you know, baby diapers, and they didn't have diapers like we know today. They were cloth, but they would, after the cloth diapers had kind of run their life, they would just throw them out in the hallway. So all this rotting trash, all this rotting food, of course, brings insects and rodents, and with those insects and rodents come lots of diseases, lots and lots of diseases. Um, diseases like typhoid and diphtheria and all of these types of diseases, scarlet fever, very common in these places, and they just ran rampant because there was no sanitation, right? I mean, think about now how we're so careful because of COVID, and we sanitize our hands, we're wearing the masks and the whole thing. There was none of that back then, and so this was just it just ran loose on these populations, and it killed a lot of people during this time. In 1882, 25% of the babies born in 1882 in the slums, okay, this is just in the slums, 1882, 25%, a quarter of the babies born will die before they turn 1 year old. Of all the babies born in 1882, half of the babies will be dead before they turn the age of 5. And this is a horrific existence for these people. So, one thing dramatically reduces the um, the disease. Okay, so here's one of the bigger problems. Before we talk about what cured it, here's the problem. Most tenements had what were known as communal privies. So if we look at this, each of these big squares here represent the tenements, these apartment houses, these slums that they lived in. So behind the tenements were these smaller buildings called communal privies, and communal privies are essentially they're essentially porta potties, is what they are. They're outhouses, but outhouses, and I'll tell you a great story about outhouses here in a minute. Outhouses, which normally would have a hole dug into the ground, okay, and you would put the outhouse over that hole, and over the course of the year, you would go to the bathroom and you would fill up that hole over the course of the year, and then usually in oh early to mid spring, you would dig a new hole for the outhouse, and you would just move the outhouse on top of the new hole, and you would use the dirt from the new hole to fill up the old hole. Well, you can't do that in in a city because there's nowhere to dig, right? The streets are made out of cobblestone and brick, and so you can't be digging down in there. So what they had were these communal privies, and they're essentially like porta potties in the back of the building. As many as 800 to 1,000 people would use one porta potty, one privy, right? Usually just one toilet in these, and there's 800 to 1,000 people living in these buildings here. So if you see these black lines coming out of the back of the privy, these were known as open sewers. Basically, they're gutters. And they're just these gutters that come out of the back of the privy. So all of this raw sewage, when you're going to the bathroom, it all comes out into this open sewer. And all of these privies then flow into a larger open sewer that goes down the back alley of the tenement buildings here. So these are smaller open sewers, gutters, coming out of the privy, emptying into a larger gutter going down the back of the tenements there. And this would flow into the local river. Ugh. So you have raw sewage all the time in the back of your privies, and this open sewer is flowing into the city river. Ugh, that it gets worse, y'all. This is where you get your drinking and your cleaning. This is where you get your drinking and your cleaning and your cooking water from, is in this water here. So when you went down to the river to get your drinking, your cleaning, and your cooking water, it's raw sewage. Ugh. And very often, these privies, right, they're open sewers. They're in the older part of the city. So the city is not really interested in servicing these open sewers. Very often, the gutter will break, right? The open sewer will just the bricks and stuff in there will break and it'll back up. Well, the sewage has to go somewhere, right? If it's not going to get here, it still has to go somewhere because people are still going. So the sewage begins to back up into the buildings here. So if you live on the bottom floor of these tenements, it was not at all unusual to literally be living in raw sewage. Oh. And then just imagine the smell of this. Say in New York, which is very, very humid during the summer, very hot and very humid during the summer. So on a hot August summer day, humid day in New York City, imagine the smell of baking raw sewage in your backyard. So, one thing dramatically improves the health conditions. One single invention dramatically improves the mortality rate and the health conditions in the tenements. The toilet. Dramatically, in the flush toilet, dramatically improves the lifestyle, the life expectancy, and the health of the people living in the tenements. Now, check this out. This is something you'll only learn here, right? This is why history is cool because you can't make this stuff up. The guy who invents the toilet, I kid you not. His name, the guy who invents the flush toilet, his name is Thomas John Crapper. I'm not making it up. I know. All right, so let me tell you my Hickmobili story here. So, some of my family back in Arkansas, Hickmobilis, right? I mean, they live back in the sticks. I mean, Hickmobilis. Super nice people. Just at some point in time, like civilization passed them by. So my aunt and uncle lived on several acres of land in Arkansas, and they had cleared the land. They're very, very dense, thick forests in the Ozarks there, and they live in northern Arkansas in the Ozarks. So very thick, dense forests there. So they lived on this land, and they had cut down about I don't know, maybe an acre or so circumference around their house of the trees. So it was just an open field between their house and the trees. And you do that because of bugs and snakes and other things that you don't want in your house. So there's this open field between their house and the woods. Now my uncle was a old style Hickmobili, right? He didn't have any running water and he didn't have any electricity. It's not until gosh, I was in my 20s or so maybe 25 years ago, that they got running water and electricity. Now, they had access to it, right? They definitely could have had running water and electricity in their house. But my uncle wasn't going to take it because that was government electricity, that's government water. I'm not having the government come into my house. I don't need government coming in my house. You know, they can keep their water, they can keep their electricity. I don't need it. I was born by a lamp and I'm going to die by a lamp. That's what he used to say, right? So they had an outhouse. And when I was about 12 years old, we're over at my aunt and uncle's house visiting, and my cousins, and I'm not kidding you about my cousin's name, y'all. My cousin, the one who's closest to me in age, his name is Larry Lee. Yeah, he's a couple months older than I am. And then there's an older cousin. He's, I don't know, 2 years older than us, I think. His name is Orville Dean. Yeah, you heard that. Orville Dean. And they had a cousin. Her name is Thelma Lou. Yeah, Thelma Lou. So, anyways, Larry Lee and Orville Dean and I were out in the woods playing hide and go seek and play war and all this. You know, it's great stuff if you're a young kid, a young boy. And my uncle, it was time to move the outhouse. So my uncle had dug a new hole. He was digging a new hole uh, for the outhouse that year. So he was working on that, and Orville Dean and Larry Lee and I were out in the woods playing. And my Aunt Opal called us in for lunch, and that's exactly what she'd do. She'd come out on the back porch and she'd just yell, lunch. So we heard her. So we start running through the woods. You know, we're having a race to see who can get back to the house the fastest. So, you know, we're running through trees and we're swinging on these like vines over rivers, you know, creeks and stuff. And we bust out of the woods into the meadow and we're running to the house. Now we can see my uncle. He's sitting up on the steps of the house and he sees us three boys bust out of the woods running towards the house across the meadow. And he gets up and he starts waving his hands and hollering and so on. And I'm running. I can't hear what he's saying, right? All this wind blowing past me. So I begin to slow down to hear what he's saying. Well, Orville Dean blows right by me. And then, y'all, it was the weirdest thing. So it was like the Twilight Zone, right? Because 1 minute I could see Orville Dean. He was right there in front of me. And the next minute, Orville Dean was gone. It was crazy. So Larry Lee and I went up to where Orville Dean used to be. Well, Orville Dean was still there. He was just below the ground. See? So here's what happened. My uncle had gotten done digging the new hole, and he had drugged the outhouse over the new hole. And he was taking a break before he filled up the old hole. Well, Orville Dean found the old hole. So there's Orville Dean floating, splashing around in raw sewage. Yeah. Now we thought it was pretty funny. Orville Dean saw no humor in it at all. So that's my Hickman Billy story. Great story, right? All right, so back to this. So they invented toilets and they're living in these tenements, and it's just life improves, but it's still not great. So here's some pictures of the tenements. Okay, it's 1879. The government of New York City decides we've got to do something about these slums. These are awful, awful places. Okay, so in 1879, the New York City passes a law which makes all of the plots of land that these tenements are built on, they make them smaller, right? So they can't be these long buildings like this, right? See how long these buildings are. The belief is if they build a smaller building, they can fit less people in them. That's the idea because it's a smaller building. They also require that every tenement must have at least one window for ventilation, right? Because a lot of these tenements had interior rooms. So there's no windows, there's no ventilation. So the air is just disgustingly gross. So they pass a law, you've got to have a window that you can open up so you can get some ventilation. Great. Well, what begins to happen, instead of the buildings being built out this way, in these pictures, buildings begin to go up, like you can see in this background here. So they're not going out long ways, but they're going up into the sky. And then buildings were built so that they had ventilation shafts going down the buildings. So they could put windows. So they still had these interior rooms in the middle of the building, but they put these ventilation shafts down the middle of these buildings. So then um, they could put windows there. And these designs, these buildings with the that built up in the air and then had these air shafts down the middle of the building. They're called dumbbell tenements because they look like a dumbbell. And this causes all sorts of new and different problems when they do this. I'll show you what happens. So this is a blueprint for one of these dumbbells, right? And you can see, right, it looks like a dumbbell, right? Here's the, the dumbbell, and then here's the handle here. And then this is the air shaft down the middle here. And you can see where these white lines are here, 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 and here. Those are windows. So these would be interior rooms. You can see how little the rooms are, right? These are nice rooms. So those were the good rooms if you could get them. These were the cheaper rooms because they were smaller, right? You can see how big they were, 11 feet by 34 feet, right? That's not much bigger than a bedroom, right? 9 feet by 10 feet. 6 feet by 9 feet. Those are small rooms. That's smaller than your bedroom, probably. So you can see there's these windows, right, out into the courtyard. Great. So you have a window. You don't have a great view, right, because you're looking at your neighbor across this ventilation shaft here. What begins to happen is we still have the trash problem, right? We don't have any trash pickup. So people begin to throw their trash out the windows. Instead of put it in the hallway here, this is where we used to put our trash. Now they begin to throw it out the windows. And over time, that trash begins to pile up. So if you're on one of the bottom floors here, in a short period of time, your view is no longer of your neighbor across this air shaft. Your view is now of rotting trash as it begins to pile up past your window. And then, people smoked back then. People would light a cigarette and they'd fling the match or the lit cigarette out the window. And they would light the trash on fire here. So now all of a sudden, these lower floors would become engulfed in flames. Ugh, terrible life. So in 1890, here's the problem. Most people have no idea what life is like in these slums. Most Americans have no idea these slums exist. So in 1890, a journalist, Jacob Riis, who we talked about the other day, goes and lives. He had toured the slums, and he was a police crime writer in the slums. Well, he actually goes and lives in the slums for an entire year, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, for an entire year. He goes and lives in the slums in New York City, and he takes pictures, and he writes about the things that he sees. And he publishes a book called How the Other Half Lives, and it was just life in the slums. And this is the first time the majority of Americans had any idea that these places existed, and two, what life was like there. And Americans are horrified by this, right? They cannot imagine that a country as rich and as prosperous as the United States was becoming at that time, we were becoming a major, major economic world power, that these conditions, that people live like this in the United States, people could not believe it. And they begin to demand that the government do something to address these problems. And as we begin to address those problems, we begin to address other problems in American society that come along with industrialization. And so there's the book, How the Other Half Lives. And these are just some of the pictures. This here is a picture of a bunch of robbers called Robbers Roost. We saw that picture of the sleeping kids, right? Here's a group of Italian immigrants in their tenement. A little girl taking care of her baby, not her baby, but her parents' baby. A bunch of guys sleeping. And then kids. And this push to begin to address a lot of these problems that came with industrialization. Labor problems, social problems, immigration problems. A lot of these problems begin to get addressed during what becomes known as the Progressive Era. This is the beginning of the Progressive Era. Progressive Era is a response to the industrialization of the United States, what is known as the Gilded Age. And we're done. All right, make sure you guys turn in your notes for this. And if you have any questions, problem, concerns, let me know. Have a great day, Panthers.